We need to go back to the year 588 BC, in the middle of the most suffocating siege Jerusalem had ever seen. Our character was Malchiah, a young potter in his early 20s, with calloused hands that knew clay better than they knew his own face. He was not from the elite, he was not a noble, he was just an artisan whose life, before everything collapsed, boiled down to the infernal heat of the kiln and the earthy smell of the workshop. His life was hard, marked by monotony, and now by the constant fear and the hunger that was a daily aggressive visitor. Malchiah was there, squeezed inside the city walls, along with thousands of others who watched hope crumble like dry clay. He kept thinking, are we going to die like this? On that specific day, at the height of that Babylonian siege by Nebuchadnezzar, Malchiah's routine was reduced to rationing water and trying to forget the empty rumbling of his stomach. He was crouched in a dark corner near his potter's wheel, which was cold. And still for weeks, due to lack of material and, frankly, lack of spirit. The strong and cruel midday sun barely reached there, but he felt the heavy, dirty air of the besieged city. It was around the 9th hour, in the middle of an afternoon that seemed endless, that the thing happened. Suddenly the lacerating scream of a woman, which came from the main street and was the constant soundtrack of the city's despair, simply vanished. It wasn't that it stopped. It was swallowed. The noise of the war outside, the murmur of lamentation, the dragging of tired feet, everything ceased in a way so immediate and absolute that Malchiah's heart gave a painful lurch in his chest. There was no silence, there was a vacuum there. What Malchiah felt was not the relief of having the clamor of war cut off. It was a cold, visceral dread that crept up his spine. His eyes, which were a deep, almost black-brown, fixed on the cracked water jar in front of him, but he didn't see it. His mind worked at an insane speed, trying to catalogue what was wrong, because that kind of quietude was unnatural. It was as if the air had turned into a thick jelly, and every movement he thought of making was a monumental effort. His whole body seemed to have been hit by an invisible pressure, and he could swear that the only thing still making noise was the agitated and unbalanced sound of his own heart, beating like a hasty drum in the middle of an empty plain. He tried to cough, just to make sure his throat was working, but no sound came out. It was a stifled, withered clearing of the throat that died as soon as it was born. Malchiah stood paralyzed, feeling cold sweat run down his temples, an irrational fear that if he moved abruptly, that silence of death could break and release something horrible that was being contained there. He remembered the old fable his grandmother told about the moments when God withdrew the breath from the earth to hear the most secret thoughts of men. Malchiah, who had faith but was not fanatical, felt at that moment that something immeasurable had bowed over Jerusalem, and that he, a mere potter, was at the center of an experience that had no place in the books. He needed to know what was happening outside, but his courage had evaporated. Malchiah's immobility was broken by an instinctive need, an order that came from a deeper place than reason. He had to go to the workshop door and look. It was an affront to any sense of self-preservation, a stupid impulse, but one that imposed itself on him with the force of a tide. The fear that had paralyzed him until then turned into an electric curiosity that burned within. He got up slowly, his knees trembling, and with every tiny step he felt he was violating the sacred quietude that had taken over the place. The fine sand on the dirt floor of the workshop, which normally crunched under his worn sandals, now seemed to have been covered by velvet, emitting no sound. Malchiah noticed that the unfinished clay pots on the shelf, inanimate objects he knew by heart, looked more defined, the shadows sharper and harder, as if the lack of sound had bizarrely sharpened all his other senses. His throat was dry, and he swallowed hard, an effort that seemed disproportionate. He thought of his mother waiting for him at home, and the worry that afflicted her, a worry that was now silenced, becoming something even more distressing than the cries of hunger. That silence was not a relief. It was a weight. The atmosphere was dense and seemed to conspire against him. The potter moved with the slowness of someone underwater, and the feeling that time had stopped was so real that he sought his own breath in his chest, relieved to still feel it, even though it seemed weak and shallow. He was convinced that as soon as he opened the heavy door, the sound would return with the fury of thunder, or he would find a scene of absolute horror, something the Bible did not tell, but that the elders whispered in the darkest alleys. He took a deep breath, trying to regather the courage that had been shattered by the silence, and placed his trembling hand on the thick, rough wood of the door. When Malchiah finally pushed the wooden door open, making the slightest noise the rusty hinge could allow, the scene outside was not one of chaos or apocalyptic destruction, but of an appalling paralysis. The narrow street, which usually teemed with the misery and hurry of those trying to survive the siege, children, crying, Babylonian soldiers shouting threats in the distance, the metallic sound of armor and the creaking of carts, was now a static stage. People were there, but they were frozen in micro-movements that seemed paused by an invisible artisan. There was a woman in a shabby tunic whose hand was raised halfway to bring a withered piece of bread to her mouth. Her gaze was fixed, but not empty. It just seemed suspended, as if time had swallowed the instant she was about to chew. Further on, a soldier, one of the few remaining to defend the inner wall, had his sword halfway out of its sheath, his arm muscles defined and tense, but absolutely motionless. Malchiah, his breath suspended, realized that this was not a collective fainting, nor a sudden death. It was something much more intimate and disturbing. It was as if the thread of life had been cut for everyone but him. He could walk, think, and feel, but everyone around was a statue of flesh and bone. The afternoon sun, which should warm, seemed only to illuminate the bizarre scenario, and the smell, the smell. That pungent odor of dirt, of burnt wood smoke, and of bodies that hadn't bathed for weeks was incredibly more accentuated, saturating the air, a sensory proof that despite the quietness of everything, the physical world had not disappeared, only its dynamic. The potter's heart began to beat even faster, and he felt a sudden vertigo, a sensation of being the only point of movement and consciousness in a universe that had stopped spinning for everyone else. The reverence he felt for the mystery was so great that he couldn't even scream, because he knew, deep down, that no sound would leave that place. Malchiah, hesitant, took another step out of the workshop, and the gravity of the situation hit him even more violently. It wasn't just the silence, nor just the freezing of people. It was the feeling that he had entered another dimension, where the rules of physics were subtly subverted. He could smell the rancid olive oil coming from a neighbor's lamp who was paralyzed lighting it, and he could see the finest dust hanging in the air, suspended, not falling, as if it were defying the law of gravity. He walked past the woman with the bread, and the proximity of that face, with the eternalized expression of near relief for a bite of food, caused him a strange nausea, a revulsion not by the woman, but by the macabre perfection of that captured moment. Malchiah hesitantly stretched out his hand and touched the arm of the soldier who had the sword half drawn. The skin was warm, with the normal temperature of a living body, and the muscles beneath the tunic were hard and tense, demonstrating the paralyzed physical effort. It was the most concrete and most chilling proof that they were not dead, just paused. The potter's heart sped up so much that it seemed to want to tear through his ribcage, and he had to hold onto the rough stone wall to keep from falling. The terror was mixed. With an almost insane curiosity, that desire to know what and why. He looked at the clear blue sky, with some white clouds that also seemed to have slowed their movement, and felt that he was being watched by something that had no form, but had intention, and that intention did not seem hostile, but was frighteningly superior. Driven by a desperate need to understand the extent of that phenomenon, Malchiah began to walk down the street, quickening his pace, his eyes now more attentive and wide. Open registered every detail of this Jerusalem in suspense. He saw a stray dog, known for scavenging, with its tongue out halfway to lick a scrap of meat on the ground, also petrified in the gesture. The animal looked like a rough, realistic sculpture. Malchiah felt an oppressive loneliness, a feeling of being the only point of consciousness in a universe of puppets. He was not a prophet, he was not a priest, he was just a common potter. Why him? Why had he been spared this collective sleep? This thought brought forth a mixture of reverence and guilt, as if he were witnessing a secret he had no right to know. He passed the entrance of a house and saw the shadow of a man projected on the wall, perfectly motionless, and had the bizarre impression that the shadows themselves were still, defying the slowness of the sun. Malchiah reached the end of the street and looked up at the top of the wall. The scene was the most impressive. The Babylonian soldiers outside, in the camp, were all in the same condition. One of them, with his bow drawn, ready to shoot the arrow, was frozen at the peak of his strength. The arrow tip was perfectly aligned for the target, but paralyzed in the air, a demonstration that the pause was not a punishment exclusive to Judah, but something that had encompassed the entire battlefield. He felt a chill in his soul, an intimate certainty that this was divine, not in the sense of an obvious miracle, but of a deep manipulation of reality that only a force that created time could execute. By then, the fear had already turned into a respectful silence within him. Malchiah, with the courage that only the experience of something indescribable can give, began to walk towards the city gates, where the confrontation was most intense. He needed to see the suspended arrow up close, that silent testimony that time had in fact been interrupted. As he advanced, he passed a water fountain where crystal drops were frozen in the air at the exact moment they should fall into the stone basin. They were not icicles, as the heat of that day was suffocating. They were simply paused drops, defying gravity and atmospheric pressure. The young potter stretched out his finger, hesitated for a second, and touched the lowest drop. It did not break apart, it did not run. It was like touching a perfectly smooth, cold crystal. The moment his finger made contact, the drop simply vanished, without splashing, without wetting his skin, as if it had been erased. This caused a silent shock in Malchiah, a certainty that he was interacting with the boundaries of reality. He withdrew his finger, and the smell of wet stone was the only proof that the water had existed there a moment before. That event, so tiny, yet so outside of any natural order, caused his faith, which was already shaken by the hardness of life, to readjust. It was not about grand miracles. It was about the intimacy of power, of a force that could rewrite physics in an instant. The loneliness weighed so heavily that he felt his own body vibrate with the lack of interaction, and the silence was so absolute that he could hear the acute, almost unbearable ringing inside his ears, the only remnant of noise that accompanied him. Approaching the gates, the scene was monumental and terrifying. The Babylonian siege engines, those huge wooden towers and destructive battering rams, were frozen at the peak of the attack. There was kindling suspended centimeters from where it would set the wooden gates on fire, and a group of 10 enemy soldiers was in the middle of a war cry, with their mouths open, tongues curved, paralyzed in their fury. Malchiah walked up to one of these soldiers. The man was large, with a braided beard and a frighteningly crafted bronze helmet, and his eyes were open and fixed. The potter, who had never been so close to an enemy without the threat of being killed, felt a strange courage mixed with deep fear. He raised his hand, and in an act he would never fully understand, touched the warrior's face. The skin was sweaty and warm, and he saw in the pores of that giant the reflection of the sweat. He was a man, not a monster, and he was there, suspended in a moment of pure violence. Malchiah felt a fleeting and bizarre connection to that enemy, both caught in the same extraordinary moment, but on opposite sides of the pause. He backed away slowly, respectful of the pause of the other's life, and looked at the arrow, the polished iron tip, ready to pierce, was there, 1/2 meter from the head of a Jewish guard, frozen in defense. The young potter realized that this event was not a sign of victory or defeat, but a demonstration of authority over the war itself. It was as if the Creator had said, "Stop. I am observing the outcome." What he would do with this pause was the question echoing in the deafening void. That deafening silence, which had already become his sole companion, began to change in quality. It was no longer just the absence of external sound. Malchiah realized that in the vacuum of that world noise, he could hear his own thoughts with terrifying clarity. Every doubt, every childish fear he tried to bury, echoed in his mind as if it were being spoken by an external voice. The potter hurried away from the proximity of the gates, feeling exposed and naked before his own conscience. He thought of his mother, of his promise that the family would be spared the worst, and the mental sound of that promise seemed ridiculously fragile in the face of that reality of war statues. The whole experience was crushing him with an ontological loneliness, the perception that, at that instant, he was incommunicado, trapped in his own bubble of moving time. He saw a raven, a black, ominous bird, frozen in mid-flight a few meters from the ground. Its feathers were perfectly open, its beak slightly ajar, and Malchiah felt compelled to touch it. But an internal resistance prevented him. It wasn't fear of the bird itself, but a superstitious respect for the interruption of nature. He wondered that if everyone was paralyzed, what sustained him in movement? Why was he the exception? The answer, he knew, was beyond his capacity for understanding, but the reverence for being the only one to witness that secret was a heavy, almost unbearable emotion. He turned the corner of an alley, seeking a little shade, and, more importantly, seeking an explanation that could give meaning to all of it, even if it was an insane explanation. His gaze met a broken clay jar on the ground, a piece of his own art, and he knelt to touch the rough clay. The contact with the familiar material brought a hint of strange comfort. It was then that he noticed something even more bizarre. In the center of an open courtyard, where merchants normally gathered, there was a beam of light that did not come from the sun. It was not a light that illuminated, it was a light that seemed to absorb the sunlight, a patch of pure, pulsing, clarity with no apparent source, floating about 2 cubits from the ground. The light had no rays, projected no shadows. It was a sphere of whiteness that hurt the eyes with its gentle intensity. Malchiah's stomach turned, and he felt an electric chill run up his body, as if the world's temperature had dropped 10 degrees at that specific point. He stopped breathing and stood there, observing that silent manifestation that seemed to be the central point of that entire pause. It wasn't an angel. With wings, it was something more subtle and more frightening, a concentration of energy that seemed to emanate absolute peace in the middle of a city of despair. He knew, with the certainty that only the inexplicable brings, that this was the reason, or at least the sign, of all the suspension. Malchiah began to approach that pulsing sphere of light with a caution that was not physical fear, but rather a deep respect for the boundary of the sacred. The smell in the vicinity of the light changed. The odor of smoke and rot from the city was replaced by an indescribable perfume, something he would associate with myrrh and the purest olive oil, but infinitely fresher and more penetrating. He felt the absence of weight in his own body as he approached, as if the earth's gravity was becoming less important. His eyes, which at first tried to force themselves to see inside the light, realized that the sphere had no interior. It was pure manifestation of brilliance. No heat emanated from it, but a subtle energy that seemed to calm the frantic pulsing of his heart. The potter felt an almost irresistible urge to kneel, not out of fear of punishment, but out of an impulse of worship that came from an unexplored place in his soul. His mind, which was too clear with the absence of noise, captured a thought that was not his, a silent certainty that floated into his consciousness. "I know what you feel." This mental phrase had no voice, but it carried the weight of total understanding. It was as if the light knew of his hunger, his fear of the siege, and his exhaustion with the routine. This communication without words, intimate and direct, brought tears to his eyes, a release of emotion he had been holding back since the siege began. The young potter, dominated by the emotion of that unexplained recognition, did not kneel but bowed, his forehead almost touching the dusty ground, and felt an overwhelming peace that contradicted the entire situation of war and misery around him. He stayed there, absorbing that energy which was more healing than a sign. When he raised his head, he noticed that the light had contracted slightly, as if it were breathing, and realized that his presence and his emotion were somehow interacting with it. Malchiah saw that, hanging on the wall of a nearby house, was a dirty cloth bag he recognized as belonging to an old neighbor known for her avarice. The bag was paralyzed in the act of falling, a loose knot that should have come undone seconds. Before the pause, the potter, driven by the mental certainty that he was being guided, stretched out his hand and undid the knot with his fingers. The bag fell to the ground with an entirely inaudible thud, confirming that the suspension of sound continued. Inside it, he found a small quantity of barley grains and 5 copper coins, a small treasure for that time of famine. Malchiah felt an immediate ethical impulse to return the money, but the silent, empathetic voice resonated in his mind. Again, take it. It is necessary. It was not an order, it was a permission, wrapped in wisdom that is not questioned. Malchiah tucked the barley and coins into his own belt, feeling a strange warmth on the hand that had touched the light. He realized that this act, stealing from an avaricious person with a silent authorization, was something he would never do under normal conditions. He was acting under an influence that surpassed his worldly morality, a permission to survive. He looked again. At the sphere of light, which now seemed more vivid and slightly higher, as if it were expressing silent satisfaction. The young potter turned around and, for the first time since the silence began, felt compelled to run. It was not a run of panic, but a focused urgency, as if he had a purpose to fulfill in that suspended lapse of time. He sped through the alleys, passing by people paralyzed in absurd positions. A man in the middle of a sneeze, his face contorted, and 2 children about to clap. Their hands in a game. He ran with the freedom of one who makes no noise, and the sensation of gliding down the dusty street without the sound of his sandals dragging was unique and liberating. However, the pressure of the silence continued to squeeze, and he could feel the weight of cosmic loneliness with every gasping breath. He wondered if there would be a limit to his movement, if he bumped into someone, if the world would return to normal with the collision, or if he would simply pass. Through the person, like a ghost. The urgency led him directly to his house, a humble structure of mud bricks, where his mother was paralyzed at the kitchen entrance. She was holding a water pitcher with an expression of deep exhaustion, the liquid frozen in the spout about to spill. Malchiah approached and hugged his mother from behind, feeling the warmth and rigidity of her body, a mixture of life and statue that squeezed his heart. He cried, tears running silently down her tunic, an explosion of love and despair that only total silence could allow. He stepped away, and with the help of the barley grains, he prepared a small porridge. He lit the fire with a friction that produced a visible but completely silent spark, and saw the smoke rise in a slow, dense and frightening movement, looking like a column of underwater vapor. The smell of cooked barley, normally comforting, was now the only warm fragrance in a cold, quiet world, a smell of life that contrasted with the inertia of reality. He waited, looking at his paralyzed mother, feeling that meal, prepared in stolen, silent time, had a ritualistic significance, a preparation for something about to happen. He knew that, when time returned, The first thing she would smell would be the food, and he would be there, waiting with the meal. Malchiah sat down on the chipped wooden chair, facing his paralyzed mother, and simply waited. The barley porridge, which he had placed in a clay bowl, began to cool, and he could see the dense vapor rising from it, also slowing its movement, almost freezing into complex patterns of mist. The wait, in that absolute silence, was the most agonizing thing about the whole experience. There were no street sounds to distract him. There was no urgency to hide the food. There was only him and the time that wouldn't pass. He looked at his mother's hands, so familiar and so still, and felt a wave of tenderness and fear. Fear that when time returned, the experience would be erased from his memory, and he would just be a man with warm porridge and an unbelievable story to tell no one. He tried mentally to reproduce the sound of the woman's scream he had heard before the silence, but the auditory memory seemed erased, replaced by a deafening void. Malchiah began to wonder what the light wanted from him, beyond that small provision. Was it a test of his morality, a chance to flee the besieged city? He knew the city gate was technically open, and the Babylonian guards were paralyzed, but the idea of fleeing alone, abandoning his mother, caused an immediate revulsion that made him shake his head in denial. He realized that his humanity was his anchor in that moment of cosmic suspension. It was in that instant of intense reflection that the sphere of light, which he had left behind in the merchant's courtyard, seemed to project itself into his inner vision. It was no longer the physical light, but a sensation of concentrated heat that hit him in the center of his chest, a transmission of intention that was clearer than any voice. The silent message was not about escape or more food, it was about witness. It was as if the light told him, "See the value of the pause. See what is important when everything stops." Malchiah felt flooded with an instantaneous understanding of the sacrifice and love his mother felt for him, and the weight of the responsibility that rested upon her, a burden that, in the hustle and bustle of life, he had never stopped to truly appreciate. He saw, with the clarity of that suspended time, that his mother had gone days without eating, giving him the few portions that were left. This intimate revelation was more powerful than the sight of the paralyzed arrow or the suspended water drops. The light was not there to save the city. It was there to save the heart of a single man. Malchiah's reverence turned into silent gratitude, and he knew the pause was coming to an end, because the purpose for him had been fulfilled. Malchiah closed, his eyes taking a deep breath of the air which, despite being dirty, now seemed charged with a new possibility. He prepared for the resounding return of the world. He expected the noise of war, the woman's scream, the grinding of the Babylonian machine gears returning with the fury of a gale. But it was not like that. The end of the silence was not an explosion, but a gradual and incredibly subtle return. The first thing he noticed was not a sound, but the delicate movement of the porridge. Smoke, which began to rise naturally and fluidly, losing that density of underwater vapor it had before. Next, it was the water pitcher in his mother's hand that made a tiny noise, almost a whisper, when the liquid paralyzed in the spout finally gave way to gravity and ran onto the stone. The oppressive silence dissolved into a soft hum that progressively increased, starting with the distant sound of dogs barking outside the city walls, a sound so common that it now seemed like celestial music. Malchiah opened his eyes and saw the slow relief take over his mother's face, who finally took a deep breath, the air held for a time she could not measure. He looked at her, her forehead sweaty, and realized that for her, no more than a second of exhaustion had passed. The experience was only his. The total return of sound hit him like a physical wave that made him stagger. The scream he had heard before the pause, the woman's scream of pain, returned exactly where it had stopped. A cutting, sound that mingled with the shock noise of the Babylonian battering ram, which outside struck the gate with deafening force. The smell of cooked barley, which was once an island of comfort in the silence, was now swallowed by the pungent odor of war smoke and human despair. Malchiah's mother, with the expression of someone who had just woken up from a nightmare, looked at the steaming bowl of porridge on the table, and then at her son. In her eyes there was no question, only a silent relief at seeing the food. She had no idea of the cosmic intervention that had occurred in her favor. Malchiah, his hands still trembling from the shock of the return, realized that he would not be able to explain it to anyone, that his story would sound like the madness of hunger or the fever of exhaustion. The intimacy of that experience was so great that he would have to carry it as a sacred secret, an invisible scar on his soul. He held out the bowl of porridge to his mother, and the gesture, so simple and human, was the practical conclusion of the entire suspension. As Malchiah's mother took the bowl, the young potter felt the weight of the coins in his belt. That small treasure, stolen under the inexplicable's license, seemed to burn his skin. A physical reminder that what he had lived was not a feverish dream, but a real intervention with practical consequences. He watched his mother, who ate the porridge with contained eagerness, and saw in her eyes the faint light of hope. Returning, a glow that hunger had almost extinguished. The silence that now settled between them was not the cosmic vacuum from before, but the familiar silence of two people who love each other and are exhausted by the war. Malchiah sat down, exhausted, and his mind began to review the details, the drop of water that vanished at his touch, the suspended arrow in the air, the face of the Babylonian soldier paralyzed in fury. Each image was a fragment of a scroll that only he had read. He tried to concentrate on the sound of the distant grinding of the siege engines, a sound that now seemed grotesquely normal, to anchor himself in reality, but the sharp ringing of the silence still seemed to persist in the back of his hearing, a sensory mark that wouldn't go away. He knew that the day would continue with the misery and threat as always, but, for him, that day had lasted an eternity and returned to the starting point, but with his soul irrevocably altered. Life, for Malchiah, had become dual. There was the brutal and noisy world of besieged Jerusalem, and there was the intimate and silent world that only he knew. He got up, the barley giving him an energy he hadn't felt in days, and went out into the street, no longer with the curiosity of the beginning, but with the serenity of one who has a certainty that doesn't need to be spoken. He noticed that the woman he had seen paralyzed with the bread in her hand was now on the ground, crying, the piece of bread beside her, and the soldier who was about to draw his sword was breathing heavily, sweat running down his forehead as if he had just emerged from an immense effort. The world had returned, and people resumed their movements from the last instant before the pause, without any notion of the anomaly. Malchiah approached the woman with the bread, knelt down, and with the moral force that the light had conferred upon him, divided a piece of the remaining barley in his belt. He didn't need to say anything. The look, the woman gave him, a look of perplexed gratitude in the midst of the misery, was the final confirmation that the pause had not been a dream. It had been a gift, a chance to reaffirm his humanity in a time where it was being crushed. That act of kindness, born from authorized theft, was the only physical trace of his silent journey. In the days that followed the event, Malchiah began to notice things in a way he hadn't perceived before. The incessant noise of Jerusalem, the clinking of coins, the sound of wood being split, the muffled, anxious conversation of the people was no longer just noise. It was the constant proof that time was flowing, that life was happening. He walked through the same alleys where he had run in the silence, and the location of the sphere of light, the merchant's courtyard, now seemed like an ordinary and uninteresting place, covered in garbage and dust, without any trace of that pulsing whiteness. The absence of any physical sign of what happened reinforced the personal and untransferable nature of the experience. He tried, once or twice, to peek at the avaricious neighbor, the owner of the barley and coin bag. She was at the gate, complaining about hunger and luck, having no idea that she had been robbed by a divine entity, and that small theft had been the momentary salvation of 2 lives. Malchiah felt a wave of ironic guilt mixed with a deep gratitude for the mystery. He had been chosen not for a grand mission, but for a moment of understanding and a small act of survival that marked him forever. He knew that of all the horrors of that siege, the total silence would be the only thing that would truly haunt him, but in a reverent and inspiring way. The strangest thing of all was the new perception of time. For everyone in Jerusalem, the siege was a slow and continuous agony. But for Malchiah, the day of the pause was a fold, a lapse where his life had been suspended, examined and restarted. He did not see the hours pass. In the same way, when he looked at the suspended arrow, which he had seen with such clarity, he felt he could, with a little effort, stretch out his hand and touch it again, even knowing that it had been fired days ago and was probably buried in some piece of the wall. This sensory memory was so vivid that sometimes, in the middle of a conversation with his mother, he would stop for an instant, waiting for the sharp ringing of the silence to return. A bizarre nostalgia for that total vacuum. The experience did not make him a hero or a prophet, but it transformed him into an attentive observer of life. He looked at people, at their effort to breathe and fight, and saw in them the reflection of the paralyzed statues, remembering how fragile and precious was the continuity of movement. That day, although it seemed like a normal day for the world, was the only real landmark in his entire life. The fate of Jerusalem, as we know, was inevitable. Months after the day of the pause, the Babylonians breached the walls, and the city fell into a chaos of fire and smoke, exactly as feared. Malchiah and his mother, by luck or by some kind of continued intervention, survived the initial massacre and were forced into exile, a long and painful march to Babylon, chained and humiliated like the rest of the people. In the middle of that crowd of desperate and dirty faces, he carried the only invisible treasure he possessed, the memory of that absolute silence and the light that had chosen him. He looked at the stars in the desert during the few hours of rest and felt that the universe had whispered a secret in his ear, a secret that had no salvation for the nation but had meaning for him. He remembered the feeling of lightness when touching the suspended drop of water, and that thought was a small mental refuge from the pain of the chains and the brutality of the guards. The experience of the day of the pause was, ironically, what kept him anchored in his sanity, because he knew that if reality could be suspended once, it could bend again. This subtle hope was what prevented him from collapsing. During the years of exile in Babylon, while working in foreign fields under the relentless sun, Malchiah's experience did not fade. On the contrary, it became sharper with the passage of time. He tried a single time, already an older and resigned man, to whisper the story to a trusted friend, a companion in exile who had also lost everything. He described the silence, the paralyzed arrow, the woman with the bread, and the white pulsing light. The friend, a practical man devastated by pain, listened to him in silence and in the end merely shook his head sadly and said that hunger and fear caused strange visions. The simple and human reaction of the friend was the final confirmation for Malchiah. That was his and his alone. That event was not meant to be a public account or a new scripture. It was an intimate revelation that had served its purpose, to reaffirm the value of life and goodness at the peak of misery. He realized that there was no epic ending or logical explanation. The thing simply happened and stopped, and what remained was the memory of a silent intervention that rewrote his heart, but not his destiny. He would carry the weight of that mystery and that wonder until the end of his days, a potter who was the only man to see time stop, and who used that power to cook a porridge. The potter lived many years in Babylon, and the siege of Jerusalem became a bitter and distant memory, except for that day. The mystery of the pause was never resolved in his mind. He never knew if the light was an angel, the presence of God, or just an anomaly of the universe. He simply accepted that he had been a witness to a secret that did not belong in the mouths of men. The absence of a logical explanation or a grand why was, in the end, the solution of the event itself. The total silence had come for an intimate purpose, a revelation of the heart, and when the purpose was fulfilled, time resumed running simply because it was time. There was no second warning, there was no sign of farewell from the light, nor an admirable fading. The thing stopped and restarted with the brutality of reality, and Malchiah, the only one to remember the interval, moved on. He knew deep down that it was not about the power to stop the war, but about the necessity of making a porridge in a world that had forgotten what it meant to feed hope. And so, Malchiah's life unfolded, marked by the silent reverence he carried. He became a man known for his unusual calmness and the gaze that seemed to see beyond things, a gaze that had seen the boundaries of time. He never had an experience of that kind again, and the sharp ringing of the silence, which persisted for years in his hearing, finally faded, becoming just a memory. The arrow he saw suspended, the tears of his paralyzed mother, the drop of water that vanished at his touch. All of this became the backbone of who he was. Malchiah lived to old age, a simple man, a potter in exile, who never understood the event that transformed him, but who learned to live with the wonder of having been chosen for a secret so intimate and human. The pause was a bizarre gift that taught him the value of the now, and he died many years later, carrying the certainty that, for a single long day, he was the only point of movement in the entire universe.